close, we ought to sing all five verses. But for this instance, we'll just do the first stanza of the national anthem. Could we all stand at attention? Dear land of Guyana, of rivers and plains, made rich by the sunshine and lush by the rains, set gem-like and fair between mountains and sea. Your children salute you, dear land of the free. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the next few days, we'll be celebrating another year of independence of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And it's customary that at independence we discuss the state of our country, more importantly, state of affairs in our country. And this afternoon, the Burnham Foundation is pleased to organize this Independence Commemorative Symposium under the theme Constitutional Reform and its Potential to Curb the Emergence of a Fascist State in Guyana. But the theme, it is suggesting that not all is well within our dear land, And the panel this afternoon, our two panels this afternoon, need no introduction. I introduce Mr. Vincent Alexander on my immediate left. Mr. Vincent Alexander is no stranger to us. He's the chairman of the Burnham Foundation and has recently been appointed a member of the Constitutional Reform Commission. Right, yes. To the left of Mr. Vincent Alexander is Ms. Amanda Walton Desir, practicing attorney for almost 2 decades in the field of international law, specialized mainly in maritime and civil administration. Currently a member of parliament with the A Partnership for National Unity, APNU, AFC coalition, with responsibility for foreign affairs. In fact, she's the current shadow foreign affairs minister, and more also a member of the Parliamentary Sectoral Committee on Constitutional Reform. So, ladies and gentlemen, the two panelists bring a wealth of experience, professional as well as in some cases academic experience on this matter. So what is going to happen? The first speaker will be Mr. Vincent Alexander. He's going to speak for 15 minutes at most, maximum.
Okay.
And he will then hand the floor to the lovely Miss Amanda Walton Desir, who is going to speak for 30 minutes. 30. No. 30 minutes maximum. You could work out how you deal with that. At the end of which, we take question and answer. So, without further ado, I am going to hand the microphone over to Mr. Vincent Alexander. Please give him a warm round of welcome.
I just want to ask a question before you go, sir. Those persons who are streaming, if it's being streamed live and they have questions, how will we treat them?
I think the technical people will indicate when there are persons proffering questions. They'll be allowed. We will hear those questions in the hall, and the answers will be provided once they're available. Chair of today's symposium, colleagues, comrades, and friends. I will be presenting on the topic, constitutional reform and its potential to curb the emergence of a fascist state in Guyana. And I will specifically concentrate on the aspect of that topic which says emergent fascism in Guyana. Fascism as a political regime in Guyana has been at the center of debate and assertions as far back as 1965, when Dr. Jagan, in writing about the post-1964 election period, stated that, and I quote, "The coalition government will resort to fascist weapons of terror, anti-communism, and racism," end of quote. In his assertion, Dr. Jagan identified terror, a physical and violent manner of controlling and silencing people. Anti-communism, a restriction of one's freedom of conscience and values. And racism, subjugation of others by a presumed superior and ruling race. These are indeed interrelated elements, among others, through which fascism can eventuate. At the other end of the spectrum, in 2010, Freddie Kissoon, in analyzing the Jagdeo regime, concluded that, and I quote, "From the time the ruling cabal shared power with a group of narco-traffickers in pursuit of gunmen held up in Buxton, Ghana has seen the accelerated transformation of a traditional authoritarian exercise of power into an open fascist modus operandi in which the term semi-fascism as a description of Guyana's government has given way to full-blown fascism," end of quote. While not itemizing the elements of fascism, Kissoon highlighted its authoritarian nature and the sexual aberrations, sexual violence, colossal kleptomania, and narco involvement that characterized fascism in Guyana under Jagdeo's presidency, as opposed to his characterization of Burnham's regime as semi-fascist, end of quote. Manifestly, the elements identified by Dr. Jagan are related to a system that enables authoritarianism and the prevalence of the perversities identified by Freddie Kissoon. Simply put, fascism may be described thus: a political idea where the government controls everything and the people are not allowed to say or do what they want. In more expansive and universal terms, literature identifies dictatorial leadership, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcibly suppression of the opposition, belief in natural social hierarchy and subordination of individuals' interests as the matrix or machinery that embodies fascism. It enables fascism as a system of governance and control to determine what is to be done, who it is to be done by, and how it is to be done. It is a world outlook enabled by the machinery that establishes it and maintains it in congruence with the beliefs and values of the rulers. If the extant Guyanese society is calibrated using this paradigm, it may well be determined that, one, our electoral system and its open list element virtually empowers individuals to determine the membership of parliament or legislature in a majoritarian system, which is also reinforced by unfettered recall legislation. Two, our presidential system enables one such person to singularly be the executive with immunity from personal accountability. And three, the party system enforces centrality and concentration of the legislative and executive powers through a governance model built around democratic centralism. That symbiotic relationship facilitates authoritarianism, which could then be further buttressed by suppression, militarism, subordination, and sectarianism, thus resulting in full-fledged fascism. This is but a sample of how our legal framework may facilitate the emergence of fascism. It is to this possibility, although not identifying the existence of the full menu of the elements of fascism, that politicians, political analysts, constitutionalists, and others, such as Senior Counsel Ralph Ramkaran, though belated, have averted to over the years in reference to the so-called Burnham Constitution, albeit no political party, when in government, has shown the appetite for change. It is to the credit of our country's dysfunctional political culture and probably the remnants of the Westminster system that full-fledged fascism has not emerged. But being penny-wise rather than pound-foolish should occasion our attention to Freddie Kissoon's alarm about full-fledged fascism, particularly in the circumstances of the demonstration of less and less tolerance for freedom of speech, as articulated by the Vice President, and demonstrated by the manner in which the Cybercrime Act is invoked. The blatant disregard for elements of governance, such as inclusivity, with regard to the local democratic organs, openness in relation to disclosure about the conduct of state affairs, and transparency in employment and the award of contracts. The denial of the status of minorities in relation to their call for equitable treatment, absolute control of the state media, trickle-down economics, and police brutality, all of which are self-evident and too numerous to be detailed in this presentation. Constitutional reform may well provide an opportunity for institutional and legal transformation that can stave off the emergent fascism. In furtherance of our independence, as we celebrate its 50th anniversary, this should be foremost on the national agenda. The Burnham Foundation repeats its call of its last annual symposium, which was held in February, for us to return our politics to ground zero and to rebuild from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. And now hand you over to Ms. Amanda Walton this year. You want to come here or you speak from here? You can speak from your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, just give Ms. Zir a warm welcome.
Thank you for the Burnham Foundation welcome. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sessional Chair, my thanks to the Burnham Foundation for the invitation. It seems as though I have my full 30 minutes, though I was willing to cede some of it. Let me begin by saying that the theme of my presentation will be, and if I could get my system to stay upright on this sloping podium, it will help. So I want to look at this from the point of view of countering the emergence of the authoritarian state and the opportunities that we're presented with as we talk about constitutional reform. And let me say from the outset, the aim of my presentation is not to make definite pronouncements rather, but it is certainly to add to the conversation and to provide us with, food for thought. I will hasten to say as well, I am not sure that there's anything new or groundbreaking in what I will say, but certainly it is good for us to remind ourselves maybe of the things that we know and might have forgotten. And I appreciate the methodology of this symposium because having heard about what a fascist state looks like and having been able to identify very clearly its manifestation in our society, it is good now that we will go into this discussion because it provides it with context. You know, very often you hear about constitutional reform, but it's often in a vacuum. And so having heard Mr. Alexander and then me coming to speak about the opportunities that constitutional reform provides us is really, really, I think, a good methodology for us to have the discussion in this afternoon. Let me say that I will focus primarily on 4 areas. I mean, there are a number of definite areas that could be focused on, but because of the time limitations understandably imposed on me, I will focus on the 4 key areas of strengthening in our electoral integrity, enhancing our judicial independence, strengthening legislative oversight, and the protection of human rights. So my presentation will center around those 4 elements. But before proceeding to discuss those 4 elements, I believe that there are some wider considerations that have to inform our discussion. The first one that comes to mind, is it reform or revision that we need? Constitutional reform, of course, is that process that typically involves making specific changes or amendments to particular portions of the Constitution, the existing Constitution, and it's aimed at improving certain aspects of the Constitution without overhauling the entire document. Constitutional revision refers to a far more comprehensive and thorough overhaul of the Constitution that can result in the rewriting of provisions, large portions of it, or an entirely new Constitution. And the purpose of revision would be at the fundamental level to transform the political, social, and legal framework of the country. So what do we need in Guyana? Because in discussing this issue of reform, you have both sides that enjoy proponents. Some say we need to strengthen what we have. Some say we need to completely overhaul what we have. So this is something that we have to keep in the back of our minds as we talk about the issues of constitutional reform and its importance in combating an emerging authoritarian regime. The other consideration that we have to preface our discussion with is the need for a holistic approach to constitutional reform. Because sure, I will touch on certain aspects, but the importance of holistic reform has to be emphasized. That is to say, we can't make changes in isolation, but we must consider the broader context and the interconnectedness of the various provisions, right? So there is also a school of thought that there's nothing really wrong with the Constitution itself inherently. The problem is with implementation and enforcement of its provisions. So I'm highlighting all of these paradigms because I think I can't ignore them in presenting this. So some say it's implementation. Then there are some that urge that the entire construct of our system, of our political system, the winner takes all system, is the fundamental problem. Because the degree to which we require inclusive governance to implement vital aspects of our Constitution, the current paradigm of winner takes all does not accommodate that. And particularly in our Guyana context. And so some see this as really a fundamental flaw in the entire construct of our system. It is true that in a socially and I would say an ethnically diverse population such as ours, in a multi-ethnic, multiracial, politically polarized society as ours, it is important that the human and social considerations be given equal footing to the technical and legalistic aspects of constitutional reform. Right? What do I mean by all of that? I mean that in practical terms, constitutional reform has to be underpinned by a genuine commitment to reform. It has to be supported by a genuine commitment to inclusivity and a genuine commitment to honoring the will of the people. So without this balance of understanding that the human will, the strictures of the human will have an impact as much as the legal form, if we fail to bear that in mind, then we could find that we exacerbate a situation. So with those background considerations that I want us to keep in the back of our minds as we continue to talk about constitutional reform, and mind you, my presentation is couched in the context of constitutional reform, I would want to turn our attention to the first key area. And like I said earlier, this is not exhaustive. I just picked out 4 of a multiplicity of elements that we will have to consider as we talk about constitutional reform and countering the rise of authoritarianism in our country. Strengthening electoral integrity. And I'm glad the speaker before me went into the issue of the list system, etc., because it will give me the opportunity to gloss over it and not have to repeat that. So what I want to focus on is that aspect of the electoral system, the procedural aspect of it, and that involves GCOM, for example, and ensuring that GCOM is truly an independent body that is free from political influence. Now, this must include transparent appointment processes and adequate funding. So when we talk about GCOM, for example, what are the specific areas for strengthening that we can address? Legal and structural reforms, enshrining the independence in the Constitution. It does not explicitly state that GCOM is independent. There is, in Article 226, I think there is a provision that the commissions are to be free from influence. But there's a school of thought that says that enshrining the explicit independence of GCOM goes or will go a long way to ensuring that we protect that very, very critical body from political interference. The strengthening of the legal framework is also a school of thought that has been proffered, and this includes clear provisions for the appointment and the tenure and the removal of commissioners. Again, I am sure that these, and particularly as people who follow the constitutional reform conversations, none of what I will say here will be new to you, but certainly the attempt is to place it in the context of what we're talking about today, and that is combating the emergence of a fascist or authoritarian state. And then we want to look at the establishment of a merit-based appointment system. So we establish a transparent merit-based process for appointing commissioners using a selection committee comprising respected individuals from various sectors, judiciary, civil society, and academia, to recommend candidates. Consideration could be given to a fixed tenure, which provides commissioners with a fixed or staggered tenures to prevent the entire commission from, for example, being replaced simultaneously. And this certainly will help to maintain institutional memory and stability. And then, of course, you have to consider, how do we enhance the operational and financial independence of a body like GCOM, right? And how do we ensure that GCOM, for example, receives its budget directly from Parliament without interference from the executive? Because you understand that the control of the resources is an opportunity for the for control, and the type of control that may be inimical to our electoral system. We also want to discuss the transparent and inclusive processes. What about the decision-making process of GCOM? Are their meetings open and their decision-making processes open to the public, to media, to observers? Consideration could be given to publishing the minutes of GCOM online and publishing GCOM decisions online for public scrutiny, right? All in an attempt to bolster transparency, which will in turn help to strengthen the mechanism. Of course, stakeholder engagement, public communications, and a critical thing that I think we fail to appreciate the importance of, and that is international standards and support. So how do we ensure that GCOM's operations align with international best practices and standards, such as those recommended by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance? Now, certainly this could be mandated rather than being left up to the discretion of, for example, whoever the chair is. So, and then we conduct regular assessments of GCOM's performance and adherence to international standards by inviting international organizations to evaluate and provide recommendations. And then, of course, we can look at legal protections and oversight. Legal protections for GCOM commissioners and for staff to insulate them against political pressure and threats and interference, and establishing a clear accountability mechanism for commissioners and staff, including strengthening a code of conduct and disciplinary procedures. And most certainly, a very, very important aspect, improved voter registration systems, using the implementation of advanced technologies and methodologies for voter registration in order to maintain an accurate and up-to-date voters list. Anybody that has been following anything about elections in Guyana understands that the severely bloated list that currently exists, and certainly the opportunity for mischief that it presents really can frustrate the will of the people and facilitate the rise of authoritarianism. Because inherent in the act of frustrating the will of the people are some of the characteristics of fascism that we speak about. So I want to move on to enhancing and strengthening judicial independence. How do we strengthen judicial independence? These are just a few thoughts. Transparent and merit-based appointments. Reforming constitutional provisions relating to the appointment of judges can ensure a more transparent merit-based process. This might include specifying criteria for judicial appointments in the Constitution and establishing a more diverse and inclusive Judicial Service Commission. Financial autonomy. Constitutional amendments really could secure the financial independence for the judiciary by guaranteeing direct and adequate funding. This ensures that the judiciary can function without financial pressure from the government. And I want to bring to our recollection that in 2015, I believe it was, the amendment to the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act was passed, which for the first time allowed the judiciary and the resources that it would need to be a direct charge on the consolidated fund. And so it didn't have to go through the executive. It was a first line item. Come 2020, I think it was 2021, that was reversed. And so you saw one government taking proactive steps, as is required by the Constitution, to ensure the independence of the judiciary. And then here is another government completely undoing that. And I think that is a good example of the tension that we talked about earlier in terms of the will to implement, because the provisions are there, but the will to implement is obviously absent. So another aspect of the securing the independence of the judiciary, because understand that in the context of the separation of powers, a strong judiciary really is the cornerstone of all that we are talking about, because there has to be someone that holds everything in the balance and that could be a check against excesses. So understand that an independent, strong, functioning, robust judiciary really is the bedrock of everything that we're talking about here today. So how about, for example, there is a code of conduct for judicial officers that has been promulgated. Should consideration be given to enshrining some of that in a constitutional framework, so that these are issues, robust disciplinary mechanisms, these are all issues that are enshrined at a constitutional level. Improving efficiency and access to justice is really, really a key element of this conversation, because again, if one's rights are trampled on, there has to be a recourse to justice. And so the ease of access to justice really is an important weapon in our arsenal to counter the emergence of a fascist state, right? So when we talk about improving efficiency and access to justice, we're talking about modernizing the judicial infrastructure. And we understand that this is an administrative issue, but certainly we must consider whether we want to enshrine this duty to modernize at a particular level so that our court system continues to grow and to evolve with as time demands, right? And then legal education and professional development. Amendments could emphasize the importance of continuous legal development and ensuring that our judicial officers remain competent, up to date with legal advancements. So in summary, as it relates to the strengthening of the judiciary, consideration could be given to amending the Constitution to specify detailed procedures and criteria for the appointment of judges, including examining the composition and role of the Judicial Service Commission. And we could consider including provisions that guarantee the financial independence of the judiciary by guaranteeing that direct budgetary allocation that I was talking about, and embedding, of course, the ethical standards and accountability for judicial conduct within our Constitution. So strengthening these three sub-aspects through constitutional reform will help to ensure that the judiciary in Guyana is independent, it is accountable, and it is efficient. And very many times we underestimate the importance of the efficiency of the judicial system, because justice must be swift and justice must be seen to be done. And so that is a very, very important element in terms of the delivery of justice. So that to the degree that we fail to make sure that the judiciary has all of the financial and other resources that it needs to operate at maximum efficiency, we are undermining the rule of law. So the third area that we will touch on, 3 or 4 that I will touch on today, strengthening legislative oversight. Let's be clear that strengthening legislative oversight is essential to tackling authoritarianism or fascism, as we're discussing here today. But the issue of strengthening legislative oversight is perhaps one of the areas of discussion that paints in very stark terms this tension between having constitutional provisions which provide for specific things, but having to contend with a government or a regime that lacks the will to implement. Strong parliamentary committees, for example, are a key recommendation in the context of strengthening legislative oversight. But if the convening of those committees is a matter left up to the government, the provision is there, but the convening of the committee, I will use one example, the Foreign Relations Sectoral Committee, of which I'm a member. I have written, I have petitioned for a convening of the meeting of the committee, but because it is convened at the instance of the chair of the committee, which is my equal opposite number in the National Assembly, it is up to their whim and fancy as to when they're going to call a meeting. The provision is there, but the intent and the goodwill to act on it in the spirit in which it was intended is absent. How does constitutional reform address that lack of will? How do we legislate to mitigate against a lack of political will to do the right thing? I do not propose that we answer that question today, but as we continue this conversation, certainly it is something that we have to bear in mind. When we talk about strengthening the legislature, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that in all of the conversations we've been having for the past few years in Guyana about constitutional reform, this question of our legislature and its configuration has come up. What do I mean by that? Do we want to remain a unicameral legislature, or do we want to be a bicameral legislature? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And so the view has been proffered. I recall when the last there was a committee that was convened. I think it was headed by Mr. Nigel Hughes out of the office of the then Prime Minister. You see that report, and one of the recommendations that came out is consideration of moving to a bicameral legislature configuration. And of course, the bicameral system, as we know, legislative authority is divided between two chambers, typically upper house and a lower house. And it is true that this division can certainly enhance checks and balances within the legislative branch itself, as each chamber can review and amend and veto other proposals, legislation rather. Another advantage is that bicameralism allows for more detailed scrutiny of legislation and a requirement for both houses to agree. As I'm standing here, I could think immediately of a practical example that happened the last time we met in Parliament. The Sea Defence Bill. Something that touches and concerns our sea defenses, which touches and concerns a fundamental right of Guyanese as it relates to their environment. So in as much as it seems distant, it is connected to our right to a particular type of environment. So we supported the principle of the matter because we're below sea level and we have to deal with climate resilience issues. So we said to the members on the other side, look, let's take this thing to a select committee. We are seeing some loopholes here. We identified the loopholes very clearly. Instead of doing what was in the best interest of all concerned, the government used its one-seat majority to power the bill through. Now, mind you, what makes this more ridiculous is that there is already legislation existing. So it is not a matter that is so urgent that if we don't address it, it will result in some loophole or lacuna or weakness in the law. But they refuse to do it. Because once it is passed there, read a second time, read a third time, it goes for assent, and that is it. And so the quality of the legislation produced is directly affected by the configuration of the House. So the counterbalancing effect of bicameralism as well has to be considered, because the presence of two legislative chambers can act as a counterbalance against the executive branch. For instance, one chamber might be more aligned with the executive, but another chamber may serve as a critical check. So it overall enhances the separation of powers. And of course, it has implications for the doctrine of separation of powers. And let me hasten to add here that regardless of whether legislature is unicameral or bicameral, an independent judiciary is essential to adjudicate disputes and ensure that the legislature that the laws are complied with. And so the judiciary acts as that crucial check on both the legislative and the executive branches. Now, when one considers the current unicameral configuration in Guyana and the doctrine of separation of powers, one sees that the concentration of legislative authority in the single house, whilst it simplifies lawmaking, because of course they're not two houses, it affects the quality of the legislation that we pass. And so the unicameral legislature, because of the inherent lack of checks and balances, require more robust supporting mechanisms so that a strong judiciary veto powers at the level of the executive or independent oversight bodies to ensure that that unicameral legislature does not overreach. Now, in this regard, the country of Kenya poses a very interesting example, because Kenya, at the time of independence, it went from a bicameral legislature to a unicameral legislature, and in 2010, it went back to a bicameral legislature. And what I found interesting is that Kenya became an independent state in 1963, right? How many years before us? A mere 3. And the fact that they have been able to engage in that level in that time, it really does make for an interesting case study. Not now and at this forum, but certainly it's something that we may look to see. Why were lawmakers in Kenya so amenable to adapting to that degree? Is it because it is a more homogeneous society? Is it because in the Guyana context, the play between race and politics dictates that where you stand depends on where you sit? So these are all questions that we have to take into account as we deliberate on this matter of constitutional reform. But what Kenya found was interesting. And the reports that we've read said that what they found is the key reasons for their reverting to bicameralism included improved representation, robust checks and balances, and it supported the decentralization of governance and ensured that the county governments had a greater say in the legislative process. And they concluded that all in all, the changes could and would create a more democratic, inclusive, and accountable governance structure within the country. So it certainly is a case for us to study. In the interest of time, I don't propose to delve into how the different electoral systems impact our legislative oversight and the overall functioning of democratic governance. Suffice it to say that both systems have their strengths and weaknesses, and I'm talking here about the issue of proportional representation vis-a-vis the first past the post system. I want to move very quickly to the protection of human rights. Now, the Bill of Rights is embedded within our Constitution under the heading Fundamental Rights and Freedoms of the Individual, and it's found in Chapter 3 of our Constitution, and it guarantees a range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights to individuals. Now, these provisions form the rights, but they're within the Constitution, right? And there have been arguments that have been advanced that maybe we need a separate Bill of Rights. Maybe we need our Bill of Rights extracted from the Constitution and separated. Why? The proponents for that argument say that it promotes clarity and accessibility, and it can make the fundamental rights and freedoms that our citizens enjoy more visible and accessible. And it will make sure that citizens are more aware of what their rights are. And it allows, they say, for focused attention on the protection and enforcement of human rights, making it easier for lawyers and judges to reference and uphold these rights. At a symbolic level, It suggests that a separate Bill of Rights is an important symbolic gesture, and it serves as a symbol, as it were, of a nation's commitment to protecting and promoting human rights, and which in the context of our national identity can certainly reinforce the values and principles on which we hope our society is founded, right? And thereby strengthen national unity and a national identity. Now, as with anything, there are arguments for and against. And those who argue against it say, you know, leaving it there promotes cohesion. It makes sure that there is not any duplication. But while there are compelling arguments for and against having a separate Bill of Rights, the ultimate decision depends on the specific context and our specific needs. And so it is something that we have to bear in mind as we continue to consult and to speak about constitutional reform. A very, very key issue that has to be addressed is the establishment of the Human Rights Commission. Because remember, we're talking about the rights of authoritarianism. And at the fundamental level, that is a paradigm that goes against or seeks to restrict human rights. And so the establishment of the Human Rights Commission is very, very important. Article 212, I think N it is, 212N, mandates the establishment of the Human Rights Commission to promote respect for human rights and to investigate allegations of human rights violations. The Commission also has an advisory role and can advise the government on human rights issues and recommend policies or legislative measures to enhance the protection of human rights. The government of Guyana has not fully implemented the Human Rights Commission, despite it being mandated by the Constitution. And several factors, I believe, have contributed to this state of affairs. The first one is what we've been talking about all afternoon, the lack of political will. And this is something that successive governments have failed to do. And I believe that it is important that civil society advocates for the establishment of this commission. I believe that we have to help civil society to understand that it is important that they advocate for the establishment of this commission. So efforts to address the lack of political will, calling on government to establish this, exploring legal avenues, as I know some of us have been doing to compel the establishment of this commission, really is an important arsenal in our, an important weapon in this fight against authoritarianism. So what we want to ensure is that all of the robust mechanisms that are in our Constitution currently, and let me say that this is not something that requires reform. It is already provided for. It requires the will to implement it. And so that is something that we can begin to agitate and advocate for immediately. I want to conclude this by saying that embedding robust human rights protection into the legal and cultural fabric of our society, the foundational principles of democracy and the rule of law are strengthened. And that is what makes it harder for fascist ideologies to take root and to flourish. In conclusion, the urgency of constitutional reform in countering the emergence of an authoritarian or fascist state cannot be overstated. Through strengthening electoral integrity, enhancing judicial independence, bolstering legislative oversight, and ensuring the protection of human rights, we can create a robust framework that upholds democratic principles and safeguards against authoritarianism. The holistic approach, considering both the technical and human dimensions, is essential for effective governance and the protection of our fundamental freedoms. So as we move forward, it is imperative that these reforms are implemented with genuine commitment to inclusivity, ensuring that the Constitution not only reflects the will of the people, but facilitates their active engagement in the process. Only then, I believe, we can hope to build a resilient and inclusive society capable of withstanding the threats of fascism and promoting enduring peace and justice. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard two excellent presentations from Mr. Vincent Alexander, in which he set the tone for the discussion. In his presentation, he basically identified what is a fascist state and to show elements of fascism in Guyana, that is currently in Guyana, practice in Guyana. Ms. Desire's presentation basically gives us ideas and suggestions as to how we can push back on the emerging fascist state in Guyana. And her presentation basically covers four identified areas: strengthening electoral integrity, enhancing and strengthening judicial independence, strengthening legislative oversight, and protection of human rights. So I think within those two presentations, there are lots of questions to be asked, or probably lots of clarification also. So what I'm suggesting, if you're going to ask the question, be very brief with the question. That's one. And I think for the record's sake, because I think we might be recording, it would be good if you could at least give us a name. So is there anybody who wants to start the ball rolling?
I want to start. My mouth is very big, so everybody will see what I am.
Recording.
No, I would just like to see the last and the two presenters. Let me just compliment you for addressing this subject really, really impressively. And while I recognize in Mr. Alexander's presentation where we identify with the elements of a fascist state and what exists now and what give birth to these various elements in his presentation, I want to say that the last cycle of constitutional kind of reform address some of the issues that Ms. Desire mentioned. But a lot of those decisions that came out of that cycle of constitutional reform were not implemented. They were not only not implemented, but those that came into being as being accepted, some of them were sidestepped, and in some cases, they tiptoed around those kind of provisions. What I want to know, yes, it is important that we address these various issues, the proposal and the suggestion to strengthen our democracy. But what is it there for us to guarantee that when these things are, because if we don't, then the existing situation that we're now experiencing in terms of the attitude and the disposition of the current kind of government will get more pronounced. So I am trying to wrap my mind around what can be done so that when you go through this other cycle of constitutional reform, the recommendation that are made that it must have some kind of provision that these things must be implemented. Having gone through those things, I would just like to hear some comments on that. Thank you.
I want to make an observation. You have to forgive me because I have to behave like a little bit of a historian.
Go ahead.
Vincent, you'll remember the Herman-Stone Accord and the Constitution Reform Commission that was established under the Herman-Stone Accord. And a number of the issues that MP Messier has mentioned were dealt with very comprehensively and exclusively during that period. The intention was that at some point we would in fact reconstitute the Constitution and put all of these things together. The difference in the presentation this afternoon is that Vincent has identified the existing perils that we face. The reality is, look, you have a Speaker of the National Assembly that does not recognize the role that he is supposed to perform. That's number one. Number two, you have a police force that is now manipulated by the state. And therefore, the police cannot be depended upon to perform the functions that they are supposed to perform. The army is now being fed with cake, you know? So the point I want to make is that, in a sense, we are really talking about two types of animals here. The animal that Vincent recognized was an animal which says, look, at this particular juncture, what we have is a government that has ignored all of the elements that it was supposed to observe. And it is doing so believing that it is well protected by the police and the army. That's the reality. Apart from that, it is protected by its extreme corruption and dishonesty. And that's as far as I want to go for the time being.
Could you come forward, please? This issue about this constitution, I believe I've read this constitution more than 30 times. And I'm going to tell you something. I write more about it than anybody else in this country. I agree. I didn't hear Vincent, but I agree with Amanza when she talked about legislation. Britain don't have a constitution. United States, they want to just push it in the pocket with for one thing. But they operate with legislation. What we lack here, let me give you some example. I write Mr. Granger, I write Jack, I write Ramatar about the Human Rights Commission appointment. And nobody ever did it. This thing is not of the constitution bad. It's the men and women we have in government who don't have no regard for laws and rules. They don't have that. We got to be fair about this thing. A constitution is dead at its heart unless it's activated by people. And I believe in what you said there, Amanso, that we need to address this issue of legislation. 77 of the Constitution, which is his pet area. Talk about the local government, regional government. He said, the regional government region shall prepare its plan, its economic plan,
and central government shall fund it. When you prepare your plan, they cut it if they don't like you.
Yes. Yes.
Right? let me understand. It's man and women we're dealing with. We got right legislation arising from this constitution. This thing we'll be talking about reform constitution, asking people all the time. Like, I'm answering thing about the question of rights. It's 37 rights we have in the right? The Bill of Rights in South Africa get 9, I believe. And United States 9. We get 37. Right? We got right legislation. When we talk about this regional thing, I had MPs in my office that I tell them go to the National Assembly, write a bill and go to the National Assembly to make this thing, put legislation in place to say what must happen. I never see anything from anybody. I ain't talking about this scrappy. I tell you, it's not this scrappy, right? It's not this, right? This was the time in 2012 when they had the protests in Linden. I'm telling you, I have a problem. We're talking about this thing all the time. What are we going to reform? We gotta get laws to lock them up. You know, let me give you an example of something. They changed the constitution in 2002, right? 2003 there, when they did the legislation on the issue of the 147, which speak about freedom and the right to strike. I've been talking to my colleagues all the time. I said, let me go to court with this thing. You know what takes them to go to court is when the teachers go on the street. Then Justice Kisun Turner said, after the unions made the presentation, that if there's a right to strike based on these circumstances. And all the thing you're talking to people, we just got to move when, we only move when we have to be back to the wall. We have a serious problem. Very, very serious problem. And we got to do something about it. I'm glad that I'm talking about it. I encourage you to continue to talk and be able to convince the people outside here. But I am saying to you that we got to act. And the society is a bit lethargic when it comes to acting. Let me give you an example of this. When they went with the, what do you call it? The 2020 election petition. Everybody come to me and ask me what I think. A good case. I say, you can't win. You can't win. You will never win. And some people vex with me when I tell them you'll never win it. You know why you're not win it? Because it's a case in court that meant demonstrating the will of the people. You can't sit down home and expect to win a political case of that nature. The judges gotta see you on the street. They gotta see you. 1997, Lance made reference to 1997. What was it? Ordmanston Accord. You know, you get it? You get it because people were in the streets. And even when the PPP, when it finished and the PPP, when government start, they had to end up at St. Lucia. You know what end up with the St. Lucia Accord? It was protest again. I'm saying to you that we can talk from now to the court. You know why this, you know how I view this constitutional reform? That Jack Dio want a third term, and they're going now for move off. You gotta read them, you know. They play cricket. When you they play them politics, they're playing cricket with football. The ball big coming, right? So they're gonna go now and they're gonna lift that caveat that he can get the third term. They pack the commission with a whole set of lackeys. And even they give labor, they say labor movement get a representative. We were never, when I check all the unions in the TUC, none of them were consulted. But they select a man and put him there. It is these type of things that we got to stop We can talk now till next week with this thing, but let me tell you this. We got to stop this thing. We got to get our children, those who have wives, you get your wives and your children. Those who get husband, for the women, you got to beat the men them out. Right? We got to protest. That's the only way we can get change. And Amanza, I like your presentation, but let me tell you what. I want to see that the Constitution say that the Constitution says, look, any member of parliament can carry a bill there once that bill do not entail financial spending on this, right? Charges to, right? We have to start doing that. We got to start doing bills and then we carry the bills them there. We got to strengthen the Constitution, not the Constitution bad. It's the men and women who run this thing. Look what Jack Dio do that, what the place name? At the PPP Congress at Chum Conference, right? Rather than they sit down, plan, and look what we can improve this state of this country. What he did, he take Ali and put the like a clown on the stage, tell he dance, and I gonna sit down here and watch at you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Special good afternoon to our speakers. You both did an amazing job. So first, I would like to make a statement, and then I have two questions. So the first thing I would like to say is that a lot of us don't know our rights. And this is the reason why a lot of the things happen that goes on in the country without people standing up, because we don't know what's our right and we don't know what we can stand up for. And because of how the legal system, mainly the police force, is used to target people and to do us things, to make us shut up, a lot of times we don't come out and we don't stand up, and also we don't know what to stand up for. So I think that that's something that we need to work on. First, we need to educate the people, because if we don't know what is right from what is wrong and what is our right, then we don't know what to stand up for and who to stand up to. The second thing, piggybacking on what Mr. Alexander said when he was talking about the quote from Mr. Jagan, whereby they're using racism to make one group of people feel superior to the other. And the other word I can't remember, but where you cause a group of people to forget their worth and their value, same thing. That is one of the leading reasons why we are more so somewhat oppressed. We are. And I feel like until we get to that point where we know who we are and we know that nobody is superior to us, we're not going to be able to make the necessary changes that we need to make, because it's a form of programming that makes us feel like we don't have a right to stand up, and it makes us feel like we deserve the things that are being done to us when we don't. And we need to know that, but with dealing with everything, you always need to get to the root of the problem, because it makes no sense you deal with just what you're seeing on the surface when the root is still there and you're not treating that, because it's always going to come back. It's kind of like a disease. If you just deal with the symptoms, you don't get rid of it, the disease is always there and it's always going to come back, and you're going to keep treating the symptoms. But coming on to my question, the first question I would like to ask to both Mr. Alexander and Ms. Amanza is, how can civilians make a lasting change? Because you listed some things that we can do. I feel like most of it was on kind of like a governmental basis, like what the government can do. But my question is, what can civilians do that can make a lasting change? Because I know that there's power in numbers. So if we can all come together and if there's some way that we can stand up for ourselves, I know that we are more likely to get a lasting effect whenever the necessary changes are made to the Constitution or whenever the Constitution is properly enforced. And the second thing I would like to say, when you were talking about the judicial system and them making the judicial system a private entity, I don't know if it's the right word, but not private, financially independent. Okay, well, good thing you correct me because I was just gonna ask about that. But all right, thank you.
So we're going to take another question. Then we have the presenter's response. We go to another round of questions.
Good afternoon to the panelists and good afternoon, colleagues. There's so much to say, and I really don't know how to say, but I'll do this. I know there's lots of talk. There has been lots of talk for a long time about constitutional reform. And then there are two main elements that keep peeping out every time. One is executive power, president, and the second has to do with the take-all system. The two main things always keep coming out. The other elements you mentioned of that we understand have been addressed long time and really have not been implemented in terms of the rights and the other legislative things that need to be put in force. My question is, what or how do we approach that process? And I want to ask a very strange question here, and I'll do it. Do we do it as a nation or as a people? Very strange question. Because I read a statement from Radichandra Singh sometime earlier today, where he said that having spent 18 years in the PPP, he left and joined the PNC because of, I'm going to use my own terms here, the lack of commitment on the part of PPP to do right by people. He said in other words, but he's saying that them guys just playing games. Spent 18 years with them, and then came over and joined the PNC, and he was there for a pretty long time. Look at what's happening today, all the way through the system, where you see that when one party rules, there's a tendency to want to have a fair play, equal rights and justice for all. On the other side, it's doom, subjugation, dereliction, and all of that. How do we approach this issue as a people or as a nation? My last question, my other point here, and I like the fact that Shikeen spoke before me, because largely this thing has to do with information, education, which is grounded really fundamentally in the history of this country, which neither nursery, primary, secondary, nor university teachers. So how on earth are we to support the question she asked? How do we support what you're asking for? We know squat. We have a situation happening in Lynn at the weekend where some guys are calling a situation where 2 persons got killed, a massacre. And when a real massacre happens, you call it some other thing. And we have a political party seeking out now to re-identify a scenario, painting pictures of all sorts. And we, the ordinary people, have no clue of what happened in Linda back then. It's not taught anywhere, we don't know it, and perhaps if not by chance, we can't do any better help ourselves. So for me, we have to find a way to ensure information, education, on the history of this country. The corrective history, not in the technical school, is taught at every level, from primary all the way up. Thank you.
So I will now hand the microphone over to the panelists to get their response to the questions asked, and then we take another round of questions.
I'm going to give general responses, but in so doing will hopefully address the specific questions. My colleague in her presentation made the point of political will. One of the conundrums we are faced with is if we recognize the problem of political will, is whether constitutional reform could deal with that problem. And it's partly in response to what Lincoln said, because he said, you know, nothing's wrong with the Constitution, which I don't fully agree with, but that the problem is political will. So we seem to have what I may call a behavioral problem in our political life. Behavior changes if the environment in which you're operating changes, and if the challenges that you face with are different. So the point I'm making in a sense is that there could be behavioral change, but it requires a change in environment. And in that regard, I'm still of the view that constitutional change, whether you call it reform or revision, but more revision than reform, can make a difference. Let me tell you why. One of the critical elements of our constitution is the electoral system. That system was confronted in 1964, and it made a difference. If that system wasn't changed in 64, things that followed would not have happened. And I'm of the view that it is the electoral system to a large extent which we need to address. We have an electoral system which allows for maximum leader and control. If we are able to change that electoral system to allow the people the freedom to liberate them, and I'm calling our electoral system in a sense the environment, things could change. If we had an electoral system that allowed free involvement, whether through the party or as individuals, then you can get a different kind of body politic in the country. So that for me, if we were to have the electoral system that says, look, in 64, we changed to PR, and we saw what that caused. But there's also a downside to PR, because it reduces accountability What it does is it introduces proportionality, but it introduces accountability. If we can find a way to balance our electoral system so that on one hand it gives you proportionality, which is a fair thing, but also gives you accountability, then probably life could be different. So we faked that in 2001 by saying we'd have a hybrid system of constituencies and PR. But the fact of the matter is, we retain the old list system so that no matter how many constituencies you got, there's only still one constituency, in the sense that it is the party. And more than that, the representative of the list and or the party leader who has ultimate control. I know the word ultimate is associated with something called sovereignty. When you speak about sovereignty, you speak about who has ultimate control. And then you look at our electoral system, the representative of the list and or the party leader retains ultimate control. Everybody else is made to be subservient. And we add to that the recall system, where we strengthen that control by saying, as you open your mouth wrong, you're out.
Yes.
But if we had a top-up list only to provide for proportionality, because right now you have 65 seats, 40 are top-up, and you are topping up a system where for the longest while the difference in the results is not more than 5 seats. But you're using 40 to top up. There's nothing scientific about that. It's a joke. We need to top up with about probably 5 to 10 at most seats, which would then release 55 for constituencies. We can then go for real constituencies, whether they be multi-member or single-member constituencies, and allow for a relationship between the voters and the parliamentarian rather than the voters and the party. In which circumstance, what happens in parliament could become different. Could be different. Because in the constituency system, not only will you allow the party to put up people, but you will allow individuals as well to run. And for me, that is a real possibility. Because if we look back to 1994, when the PNC did not contest the NDCs and allowed for community groups to contest the NDCs, we saw something that was very, in its early stages, but emergent. If you go back and check those results, you could see a lot of community cross-fertilization taking place, where people seem to have come together based on issues rather than party loyalty. And so the results will show you in places like Sussex, Caledonia, the community group prevailed. That in BV Triumph, the community group prevailed. That in Firish, Gibraltar, the community group prevailed. And in all these places, we have pushed right back into the party system, and the community groups don't stand a chance in that circumstance. So I think that the areas of our Constitution, if we provided the legal environment that could impact behavioral change, we could start to make a difference. And yes, Lincoln, in some regards, the Constitution doesn't need change, but you need enabling legislation to show that you're serious about the Constitution. And that has to do, for example, with the local government system. If we have true devolution in this country, along with the electoral system which allows the community to determine who they want to represent them, and we have true devolution, then the importance of political parties and tribalism could be decreased. And we can start to have things happening at the local level where people act based on what's impacting them rather than to whom they should be loyal. But we have good things in the Constitution about the local government system, and even some good things in 2801, no, not 2801, Act 12 of 1980. But we haven't allowed those things to fructify, haven't allowed them. We sat in the Constitution Reform Commission and said that we want accountability. And I can take you and show you, we put the words in the Constitution, we put the words in the Local Government Act. Accountability. And then we create an electoral system that does not allow for accountability. And then we do not give the kind of resources that allows for a degree of autonomy and independence. But it all comes back largely to the behavioral question, the will, which is comatose because the environment is not there for the will to be released. An environment handicaps that will, which exists within us, but is not manifest beyond us because of the environment in which we are. That question of what we could do, the level of civil society, check history and see what Poland did. Don't know if you knew what took place in Poland. The driving force was the Catholic Church, if I'm not mistaken. But it is civil society that brought about the change in Poland. I think we are partly handicapped by the way our society has evolved. That's a critical issue. The way in which African people came to Guyana and how their presence has influenced their being, and the way in which Indian people came to Guyana and how their presence and their history has informed their being does not easily lend to what we're trying to do. And you should note, when we refer to the African, I said how their presence but not subservient in a homogeneous way, subservient in a heterogeneous way that does not lend to us working together. It does not lend, and that has to do with our historical paths. this requires two things. It requires our intelligentsia to unlock the strangleholds, and for those beyond intelligence to take up that unlocking and actualize it. So intelligence will kind of show us what the problem is and proffer solutions, and then the others can, with the intelligentsia, try to bring about those solutions. We do not have an intelligentsia that serves the nation. We either don't have, or we have those who are still slaves of the history that has fashioned their being. I think I should stop because I think I'm probably too abstract, probably esoteric, and I'm probably not communicating.
Well, I could assure you that you certainly were not. You know, and Mr. Alexander touched on the button of the issue. How do you legislate against a lack of political will, or to mitigate against that lack of political will? It's a question that requires exploration, and of course, Mr. Hines asked, so what do we do? What are the approaches? I don't profess to have all of the answers, but let me start off by acknowledging a position that Mr. Lewis took. The UN Convention on Human Rights, the Charter. I always remind people that in one of its preambular paragraph, it says this, and I'm quoting directly from it. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of the law. What that is basically recognizing is that everything and everyone has a limit. And so to prevent rebellion against tyranny and oppression, it is essential that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So what do? I was making a few notes as the questions were being asked, and I want to pivot off of something that Mr. Alexander said, the role of civil society. The role of civil society cannot be overstated. And the reality is that in Guyana, our civil society is not as mature as it should be. But civil society has an important role to play. Grassroots mobilization. Grassroots mobilization, critically important. And I'm just going to touch on a few in the interest of time. What about legal and institutional approaches to tackling this issue? Litigation, public interest presents one possibility, and international pressure and advocacy. It is important to speak up. It is absolutely important to speak up, but it comes back to the point that the young lady made when we talk about the issue of the psyche and of docility and of not even understanding that it is your right to speak up. And so the conversation shows us that there is, outside of the legal and formal work, that there is work to be done at the psychological level. Which ties back to what the good gentleman asked. Are we going to tackle this as a people or as a nation? Because if I understand, and if we are of the same understanding, A nation is a collection, is a group of people who are forged by a common consciousness, a common identity. A people are just a collection of people within a geographic space. And so, are we even a nation? Do we share a common identity? Do we share a common level of consciousness in this country? That will be the catalyst for the change that we want to see. The answer could be a resounding no. Because I've always asked, what is the Guyanese identity? The other one that we could look at as well is, how do we leverage international financial arrangements? Preconditioning loans and grants and international aid, attaching conditions to those, are a very important mechanism, so that it must reflect, or it could be a condition of the loan, that certain human rights, certain conduct from the state as it relates to human rights has to be demonstrated. That's another mechanism. And of course, building alliances and internationally, with established networks, with established organizations. And so it has to be a holistic approach, a multifaceted approach to tackling the issue. The other question that was asked, there were so many questions asked, but I think the point that we want to emphasize is that for us, for any nation to see lasting change, it requires an empowered, enlightened people. And that is the key. Because I hearken to the example of Kenya, 3 years older than us, but displaying amazing agility as it relates to their arrangements. Why? Why are they so amenable and ready to change, and we are not? So these are all questions that we have to ask, but I hope that we see those 5 strategies as being tools that we could immediately implement: grassroots mobilization, leveraging international financial arrangements, legal and institutional approaches, public interest lawsuits, and of course, building alliances internationally so that we are able to amplify and put a spotlight on the excesses that are occurring.
We'll take another 4 questions, then have the panelists respond. Please come forward.
Thank you very much and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, panelists. I deduce from the presentations and the discussion just now that there seems to be a common denominator, despite it being guised in diplomatic language, perhaps not wanting to sound the alarm bell. But it occurs to me that we're talking about a revolution of the mind and a revolution of our actions to bring about the desired change we hope to see in this country. Because, Amans, in your presentation, you spoke about the political will. We face a situation where we're governed by a rogue government who has no regard for people's rights and civil liberties. On the other hand, we have a people who have been beaten into the ground and seem to have no other recourse to this beating that we've been taking. What next? What else can we do? In the parliament, they say, you, the opposition, you'll have your say, but we'll have our way. The teachers strike. They when the bargain, they went back to work, they got nothing. The court said the teachers asked for bread, they got stoned. What more? What more the people of this country can do to bring about the desired change, except for a revolution? It is about time we remove from our position of docility and move towards action. And except we do that, people continue to ride us and rub roughshod around us, and we keep, look, 57 years of independence. And where are we today? A fascist state. After 57 years, we're still struggling with these fundamental issues, with oil resources, and we cannot see any progress towards any well-being of the people of this country. What next? We see what's going on in Haiti. I believe that is a turning point. We see Burkina Faso. We see Niger. Except the people stand up and take these radical steps, people are going to continue to ride you. People are going to continue, and that's what we've been seeing for these last 57 years. Because the docility of us, we continue to be ridden and ridden and ridden into the ground. What next is the grave. So the diplomacy and going around and coming around, we are leading our people to their death, because we continue to be diplomatic and we don't want to rock the boat and we don't want to belly the cat. And so we continue to slip and slip and slip and slide, and there seems to be no resolution to the problems that we develop as a people.
Good afternoon. Simpson de Silva, coming after my good friend, Mr. Ben, with similar sentiments. However, I come with my moringa powder, which was made from Saigon leaves, and I come with neem leaves, which I also make neem powder. Two of Guyana superfoods, two of the world's superfoods. And I would like to have these herbs speaking for me. As a matter of fact, I've started to use them around the country. Moringa would be speaking, or Saijan would say, Neem would say. And we would, I'm calling on us, to Saijanize, or cause a Saijanation to happen. In other words, is one of the best solutions that the ordinary people can take to solve the poverty problem, solve the hunger problem, solve the ill health problem, solve the ignorance problem. And I can go down the line about inequality and inequity and employment and so on. Our environment has excellent provision for what we can do as a people in our villages. We don't have to go and ask Mr. Jack Dale or Mr. Ali. We don't even have to ask Vincent. We can just go down in the village, educate the people. Education, critical. For lack of knowledge, you perish, you punish, and you'll die. I can speak like this because I'm one of those who are marginalized. I was in the system during the Granger government working at the national level. I was rooted out from there by Dharam Lal. I remember he's the one who came in as minister. And I remember vividly, he didn't understand some basic elements of community development. And even a year and 2 and 3, I checked. And those are the people who we allowed to put out from earning an income. People like myself, Gilbert, Royston, many others who we hobbied together to work and earn. Not 8 to 4, we work at least 8 hours beyond the 8 to 4. And after that, absolutely categorically, no representation, no jobs, no opportunities to succeed. We are saying at this time, call it whatever it is. I am saying let us take the bull by the horn. Go down in the communities, do what we got to do. We take control now. I don't know how the MPs may understand it and figure it out. I was an MP once, and there's only one way. Burnham used to have it, you must talk, but you got to act, and you got to solve problems. Otherwise, get out of the way. He will step in, doctorate, and all the rest, and get it done. The time for that is now. Moringa say, Saijan say, let us take the bull by the horn. Let's go in our communities. Let us lead. Let us educate. Let us do some things that we were told to do. But when? Now. Don't wait for when you come in power. Guess what? We in power. We got power, but we're not using our power. We have a lot of land, and we're not using our land power. The people are coming and snatching them away. Go to Ibini. Go to Takama. 2,000, 3,000 acres of soil by the conglomerates of other people than ourselves. Go on the other side of Ibini. Go to Kimbia, 30,000 acres by foreigners. Go to livestock farm, Ibini, where we spend billions of dollars in labor. Now, when you go there, you can't even say. They're begging you. Don't tell them you've been here, because we're going to lose your job. But you've got over 2,500 of our Ebola cows on our land. Cows as far as your eyes can see. And then they come in on the coast, on the banks, looking for hundreds of more land, acres of land. And in our banks and coasts, taking away we land. And guess what? We sit back and we want more conversation. I'm saying to us, let us have the conversation, let us take action, let us solve the problems in our community right now, and let our people benefit from the prosperity that this country resources has to offer us in this so-called rich oil and gas, natural resource based environment. I would close by giving you one humble example, and I hope you all remember it. I'm from the quarantine. I have interests on the East Coast. Lived there a long time, 17 years. I have interests on the west side. I'm in one of the houses there. And I'm planting up my yard, the homestead. And I got some land. Got some friends who got land too. Calling on them to plant every square inch. But I can tell you, gas, the shore is there. Big time. The bill of facility, $1.325 billion. Water treatment plant. 3 houses from where I am. 99% of the workers that were there from the beginning to now, foreigners. That is the reality of this country. A lot of investment will be happening, but your brothers and sisters may not touch them jobs. I'm saying to us, go down to our villages now and let we do what we're supposed to do. Thank you.
Yes, good night, everyone. Kibwe Copeland. I would like to say that, of course, I'm moved by the presentations, both from Vincent Alexander and the Honorable Manzo Walton Desir. And I believe when it comes to many of the questions asked, we talk about how do we move forward? What's the next steps? We hear about governments, we hear about politicians, we hear about the people. And of course, it takes me to that term leadership. Who leads the charge? Because we talk about every one has a breaking point, which is very true. Everyone has a breaking point. But as my godfather, Sean Ben, mentioned about stone and how much more we can take, if you were to pull a rope could either tear or burst. If it tears, it drops into its submission to its environment. But if it bursts, it retaliates, hits whoever is pulling it. What is the state of our people? Are they tearing or are they about to burst? And a lot of people are at a tearing stage, while there are some who are bursting stage. And I think it goes, what I mentioned about leadership is that people are waiting, even though we are angry, we want to retaliate against, whether it be this present regime, whether it be your boss or something like that. You're looking for some level of leadership can give you assurance. This is how we're going to get it done. Or this is the kind of motivation that is needed. I know today, every time I walk and I talk to people, people are ready to retaliate. But here they say, if I go and retaliate now, tomorrow, won't get me back. If I go in the streets, I can't afford a lawyer in case they lock me up. So who is going to supply that level of leadership? Who's going to start making that charge? Because people at this point in time are frustrated. People don't like the system. They don't like what is happening, but they feel like they have no choice. If I talk out tomorrow, I'm left alone. I get either knocked off my job or being put out, blackmailed, or shot at. So it's very important for us to now establish leaders who will actually pave a way. This is how it can be done. These are the options. This is what can happen, worst case scenario, and this is what can't happen. And when we look at all the elections that happened, the last elections, 2020 elections, after we had 2 declarations, we still went to a petition, we still went to a recount, then we went to courts. So a lot of people be like, you know what, it makes sense I vote any longer because as a judge can make the decision who go in power. There's all of these roaming thoughts that happens all the time. And people are now dumbfounded. They say, you know what? My vote doesn't count. My act, my words doesn't count. How do we institute the leadership that will actually motivate people to say, you know what? I could actually take this chance. We could actually take the road. My friend here said it well. The people have to come out. But how? Civil society have to come out. But how? It has been done around the world. For some reason, of course, we're getting a little slow pace when it comes to being done in Guyana. But I think that's a very fundamental thing. Because when you talk to anybody, especially the younger ones, we got to look at the majority. And as a young person, as a youth advocate as well, I always try to trump this mode of youthfulness. The majority of our society are youth. And we have to learn how to what should I say? Simplify. Thanks, Corbett Hines. Simplify things. Because, for example, we talked a lot about constitutional reform. We talked about fascism. We talked about a lot of things. And are we including the entire society when we speak? This is good for persons who have understand it, who read it, who might have some level of knowledge to a certain level. But when do we start to go into breakout sessions to simplify this? So the man on the street could understand exactly what you mean. What fascism mean, right? Being a fax out to start to do email. So we have to be able to simplify it because the majority who we want to come in the road to actually rebel against this whole system are not the ones who are actually on terms. And I'm not trying to say that we have a society that is illiterate, but we have to be very factual to the reality. Most persons are focused on bread, butter, food, school fees, taxi fare, gas in my car. How do you come to the level and let them understand how what we're speaking about today or tonight affects the gas, affects the school fees, affects the food. And once you can appeal to people on a personal level, I believe, of course, they start to understand, you know what, this can be done. So I think leadership is very important, and of course, making things very simple as possible. But I just want to commend the both presenters. I think it was well done. The historical aspect that Vincent Alexander would have given, and of course, looking at all the pros and cons and the possibilities that the Honorable Amanza Walton is here would have bring to us. So thank you very much.
One final question or comment?
I want to make a comment. Just to add something. I want to add something to what you said.
Okay. Let me stand here to rest my notes. No, I'll be short. Less than 5 minutes. So good night. Thank you very much for organizing this forum. I am a Trinidadian. I came in a couple of days ago and I'm leaving on Monday. And I wanted to attend because I'm an academic, and anything that's intellectual and that has a lot of discussion, whether for and against, I want to be enriched by that kind of knowledge. So I am a Trinidadian, as I've said, and sometimes it's good to have an outside view because sometimes you're too close to the problem and you can't see it. So you can see the forest, but you're seeing the trees, but not the forest. And so I just want to give you my 2 cents word, which will be about 2 minutes long. I like the points that you have mentioned, Honorable Desir, is it? Yes, Amanza, that you have touched on some very important buttons. And one of the many points that you have mentioned is that we need to forge alliances. In this society is based on race and racial politics. We have ethnic-based parties. You have the PPP, largely Indian, the PNC, largely African. In Trinidad, it's the same. It's a mirror. You have the PNM, led by Keith Rowley, African, largely African. You have the UNC, largely Indian, led by Kamla Prasad Bisesa. You have mentioned a lot of problems here, but it's the same problems we face. Because the Indians, like my opposition, like you, largely African, is in opposition. And we can say almost everything you have said, we can say it in Trinidad. We have, you've mentioned the government and the leader that does not represent, I want to quote you, no regard for rule and regulation. No regard. You have mentioned rogue government. That's what we have. We have a lot, massive corruption. I don't know if you know the case of the ladder. They bought some ladders for the fire services. They were wooden ladders. They spent millions of dollars that couldn't fit on the fire trucks. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody charged. How is a third world problem? It's not only Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, it's a third world problem. Therefore, you need to forge alliances with other opposition parties. You need to forge alliances with us, Indians, from Trinidad and Tobago, who are in opposition. We face common problems. And if you do that, it will show that you transcend race, which is good, because you're looking at the human condition. You are looking at people, not just because of the color of the skin or the texture of the hair. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, there was something, you would have read it, a bill that was has to be approved by cabinet for $3 billion, TT. And then our Minister of Finance said that was a typo, something with a computer glitch. After he was caught, he says that, so corruption galore. So I want to conclude by saying that this racial politics has to end. These race-based parties have to come to an end. We must form alliances. And as opposition, I want to advise you, you have to form alliances, not only with Trinidad opposition, but all the civil society groups. Somebody mentioned how should civil society act. You have to form alliances, but you can only seize government if you have a strong opposition, which we don't have in Trinidad. And some people are saying we don't have it in Guyana too. This is what I'm hearing. I can't say yes or no. And otherwise, you would never gain power. And we have a weak leader, opposition leader in Trinidad and Tobago, in Kamala Prasad Bisesa, and she doesn't want to go. I don't know if that is the case here. I don't know. I don't live here. So I don't know. So in concluding, last statement, we have inherited this colonial legacy. We are victims of it still. And you know what the British wanted to do? Divide and rule. So they divided us, and so they have this constitution, which we must throw out. Because first past the post is not working for us. The proportional representation is not working for us. We have to fashion our own constitution so that all of us, regardless of the race, color, creed, we can enjoy the fruits and the resources of this land equally. And how you mentioned inclusion and equity, and that must be reflected in all spheres of society, everywhere. Thank you.
Good.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to first start by dating back to 2011. I remember when the APNU formed together with the AFC, the combined opposition became the majority, parliamentary majority. I was sitting in a constitutional law class, and my lecturer, the late Justice Duke Pollard, he was excited, and he told me, well, us rather, the students, that our generation is fortunate because we will now see how the Constitution works either for us or against us. And that statement left with me, and it has brought me to this point. Because while I am no expert, I have noticed many things about the Constitution that it works for us, given how the parliamentary composition has unfolded since 2011 and where it has worked against us. MPU mentioned separation of powers. That is one, in my own opinion, one of our problems, because while the cabinet constitutes in part the executive, we find members of cabinet also forming members of the legislature. So they're ministers and they're sitting parliamentarians. The issue with that, where the lines has been blurred, is that when the Granger administration took power, an attempt to investigate acts of corruption, alleged acts of corruption during the Jack Dio and the Ramatar administrations, what we saw happening was that Jack Dio came and Jack Dio said, oh, I give this person a specific instruction to do that act. And correct. And what that effectively did was in part shut down everything. Because while as an MP, as a legislator, they may have been, an MP, you will correct me if my thinking is erred. While as a legislator, they may have been able to face the court on these allegations, as part of the executive And as the president saying, I give part of my arm an instruction to do a specific thing, that kind of eliminates the accountability aspect of the entire dynamic. Now, my question is, given that, how, and I know both presenters touched on it briefly, lack of political will. Given that, and given what I've just said, and specifically, let me mention as well too before I ask my question, what we saw happening in 2020 post-election was please don't stone me, was a clear violation of the Constitution. It doesn't matter how we dress it up. It doesn't matter how it happens. It was a clear violation of the Constitution. And I do remember members of our side speaking out against it. However, because it served the interests of our opponents, they allowed it to happen in the sense that they did not take us to court. They didn't appeal the decision, even though unconstitutional, and it was made by an executive that was at the time protected by the same Constitution we're now discussing. The issue is, in my view, while you're in opposition, you see all these holes, but while you're in government, the hole serves you. And in the event where the whole does not serve the collective unit, right, meaning it just serves the executive and other parts of your members or so forth may speak against it, it's ruled out basically because the executive is protected by the same Constitution. And in more or less, they're above the law. They're the president more so speaking. So with this dynamic we have in our society, the lack of political will, the fact that holes serve you while you're in the hole, right? And while you're out of the hole, then you notice it and you're like, oh, this needs changing. How do we move forward? How do we address constitutional reform on that footing? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Well, I'm glad I came, and I just want to say, I don't want to be insensitive. I feel your frustration, and I know you have an uphill battle, right? That's a given. I know Vincent for a while. I've never known Vincent to speak for 15 minutes and stop. So, this is the first time, so he deserves a medal. I just have a quick question. I'm sure if Freddie Kissin was here, he would revise that definition. But
I agree with you.
But I'm just curious about, is the emerging apartheid state, which was something that came out before, is that incorporated into the notion of, I think you mentioned emerging fascist state? And how do you measure the two concepts? Is that something that you dropped, or is that something that's modified, or is that part of the new definition?
Thank you very much for that question. So we go now to the panelists to give their response.
All right, let me respond to Beto's last question. And I'm saying Beto because it's the way I refer to my colleague. We first met at Ideas. First met at Ideas in the 80s. In the 80s. Sorry, Institute of Development Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ghana. Answer the question this way. I was one of the persons who was invited by Coffee 250 to do a presentation at the conference under the theme, The Emerging Apartheid State. Right. I and my associates and at Padre G have been punished for daring to associate ourselves with that conference. Because it's immediately after that conference that the onslaught started, and Mr. Jagdu was clear that we were biting the hands, they say, that fed us. He actually said that. The fact of the matter is that if anybody listened to my presentation, I did not conclude that we had an apartheid state, because I used and normally use classical definitions. And for me, apartheid is associated largely, definitionally, at its core, with segregation. And then things follow. And I couldn't contend that we had that kind of segregation in Guyana, and therefore did not conclude that there was an apartheid state. But did sympathize with those who came to the conclusion, because people tend to confuse definitional elements and peripheral elements. I try not to do that. And for me, the fundamental definitional element was not present. And so I couldn't conclude it was an apartheid state. But I understood what led those who said what they said to really said. I am going to claim authorship for the theme of today's symposium, which says emergent fascist state. Did not say a fascist state. It said emergent. And it is on that precipice that the Burnham Foundation is trying to find a way to pull us back. To find a way to pull us back. But we haven't explored all that there is to be explored on this question of fascism. We have not explored the singularity of leadership in a fascist state. We haven't explored that. And I think it's one of the most dangerous elements in Guyana, the singularity of leadership. Because while it might not be de jure, de facto we are faced with the singularity of leadership. And when you attach the quality of the leadership to the singularity, then we are endangered. We are endangered. And the danger is even greater when the PPP's Congress moves motions to remove Marxism-Leninism from their constitution, which they have long removed from their thinking and their actions. There's nothing Marxist, Leninist about the PPP in terms of its economic policies and things like that. Nothing, absolutely nothing. There is something which could be claimed to be Marxist-Leninist, but more Leninist-Stalinist in terms of their politics. And they have said to us that they retain in that democratic centralism, which speaks the singularity, and which, if we are to look at the realities of our society, we are seeing that singularity with all else that goes with fascism, right? And so I really can't draw the parallel between the apartheid concept and the fascist concept. I think that we are far gone on the curve of fascism in relation to the curve of apartheid. And probably the people who called it apartheid were really talking about fascism.
There's more in our system that facilitates fascism than apartheid.
Thank you. Thank you, Elder Lance Carberry. So that's where I am on that question. You know, when every Thursday we have the most classic demonstration of the singularity and the danger of fascism. When Jack Dio sits on that press conference, you're not sure whether he represented the government or the party, but he made it clear in one of those press conferences that it's a government of his party. It's not a government of the people. It's a government of his party. And he's the general secretary of that party. And so the government is answerable to him and he can speak for everything about the government. He made that clear to us. And we seem not to understand what is being told to us. Jagdios tells us the most crass things in crass language. And we seem not to understand what he is saying. And simply because of our political history, we said he's a very good politician. That's what we say of Jack Dio. Whether we like him or not,
Who says so?
whether we like him or not, a lot of people in this country, a lot of people describe Jack Dio as a good politician. And they describe him as a good politician is evidence of one of the dysfunctionalities of our entire society. Because when they describe him as a good politician, what they're saying in some regards, it is not he, is them doing the same thing. And that is why I started off in my presentation, going back to Chedi, talking about fascism in relation to the PNC, and Freddie, talking about fascism in relation to the PPP. Because one of the problems we have in Guyana is a problem of magnitude, not necessarily a problem of difference. Not necessarily a problem of difference. It's a problem of magnitude. And so, you know, Sean Ben, the problem with revolution is that unless you are very explicit about what you mean, then it's very ambiguous. Lots of people want to use the word revolution or it means violent revolution. I don't know if that's what you meant. And I would like to distance myself from that because I don't want to get locked up for sedition and I don't want to be Ben Scott or Wharton. Right? I don't want to spend time in prison at my age. So even if I embrace the idea, it would not be publicly announced. There are some issues that we have to address. Sean got up here or somebody got up here and used the word we. Let me tell you something, Guyana, I don't know who is we. I don't know who is we. Because reality is more subjective than objective. And though you may describe people objectively as we, in reality, they might not be we. And that is one of the greatest weaknesses of Marxism. Talking about this working class, objectively, but who in terms of their mentality are not necessarily a homogeneous group of people. right? So and that's one of the big problems with Marxism and why it has had to resort to democratic centralism, because it is democratic centralism that creates the we. It is not their being from their subjective perspective that creates the we. It's a democratic centralism. But the danger of that democratic centralism, it says that of this we, there are those who are most conscious, and therefore it's only those who have the level of intellectual existence that are capable of giving leadership and being the leaders. That is what it says. And that's the kind of dangers that I am seeing in our society, because that concept and institution has been retained and is being defended, and we are being subjected to it because our legal system facilitates its fructification. If we didn't have a legal system that said the leader of the list, the leader of the list players, not allow democratic centralism to impact the nation the way it's impacting it. And therefore, we have to look for ways in which the legal system, the environment, changes and does not allow the seed to grow. The environment has to change, but not allow that seed to grow. That's the challenge. That's what this topic is really all about. I don't want to say much more, but my Trinidadian friend, I don't fully agree with you. Trinidad better off than Guyana.
Relatively.
Right? Everything is relative. It's better off than Guyana. I wrote an article in 1992 after spending a sabbatical, it was a fellowship at St. Augustine. And in 1991, I think you all had elections. Well, the Pandey won, not 91. 95, but he had elections in 91, right? Had elections in 91. And I was able to go to rallies and things like that. I went to the university that had a fire up the same time, Woodford Square. And I wrote an article, it's still available. I said the difference between Guyana and Trinidad was in Trinidad, y'all accept winning and losing. In Guyana, we don't accept winning and losing. That was my conclusion. In Trinidad, with all the problems y'all have, they got winners and they got losers, and the matches come to an end, and then you just go back to your other problems. In Guyana, our match don't end. In Guyana, nobody wins and nobody loses. The match is like, when you was a small boy, you got a never done sweetie. Or we used to run a race, 1 to 1, right? The race is no defined distance. Lose. Right? That is the state in Guyana. So that there's a little difference. And I think that in Trinidad, there are some elements of culture which have crossed the divide. In Guyana, a Minister of Education on one side of the fence tell the nation that matrimony is a vulgar lawlessness, wind down and ting down. So they ain't cross the divide, right? But in Trinidad, Carnival has crossed the divide. And even if you don't like it, they're quiet about it. They accept that it's a way of life in Trinidad. But he had pushed back against matrimony in Guyana. When you're going away? Monday. I want you to stay from last night to Tuesday and see what going on. The same people who caused matrimony see what they're inculcating. But the question is, for whom? For whom? So that I have a problem with the we, and I therefore come to the question of the unity, because this assumption that the we could unite, you know, it's problematic because of who the we may or may not be. And that speaks to the need for us to be a collective based on something else other than what we are collective on. Unfortunately, in Guyana, and when we bold here, that affects the people of African descent more than it affects the people of Indian descent because of cultural elements that cause Indians to behave different and therefore to be more, I would say, submissive to their leadership, and as opposed to people of African descent who are less submissive. But still, we try to judge each other by each other's values and not accept the realities of our diversity. So that some black people tell the PNC, why y'all don't behave like the PPP. But they're not PPP. They're behaving how they just behave. And the PPP behave how the PPP just behave. And what we need is to respect these differences rather than try to mimic each other. To respect these differences and to create an environment where there is respect for differences and where we don't interfere with personal rights, we don't interfere with community rights, and we've tried to find common ground in terms of societal rights so that what an African Guyanese does, once it does not hinder us to the wider community, is nobody's business. What an Indo-Guyanese does, once it's not hinder us to the wider society, is nobody's business. Society should tolerate and accommodate. That is the realization of your being. That's the fundamental human right. What the community does, the African community, whether it's in the form of the church or the physical community and the Indian community does, what they do does not interfere with the national good, it's nobody else's business. And then we have to get to the point where in big boat, we find common ground. That common ground is easier found if we allow personal things to be personal, community things to be communal, and national things to be national. And we have a system of devolution which allows people to control their own turf as we seek to find compromise and consensus in terms of the national turf which we all occupy. That's my last word.
I just wanted to draw your attention that the reason why Kofi committed suicide is you touched it there. Our inability to accept leadership.
I think to follow what you just said is a difficult task. So I'll just say that you certainly have the last word on that. Leadership is important. Being able to crystallize the issues to a degree that it is easily understood and assimilated is important. And so I don't think I have much to add to what Mr. Alexander said, except to say that everything really does rise and fall on the quality of leadership. And thank the Burnham Foundation for having me. It was certainly an enriching exchange, and I would want to see this program replicated throughout the length and breadth of Guyana. I want to see this program going to the Quarantine. I want to see it in Essequibo. I want to see it in Linden, because this type of information, this type of connection, breaking bread, as it were, is important and could be the catalyst for the change that we want to see nationally. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. We're now bringing this program to a close, but before we do that, just two important announcements. Firstly, membership forms for those persons who are interested in being members of the Burnham Foundation. The membership forms are available at the desk at the back. Secondly, tickets for our annual CARICOM Day brunch, which this year is going to be held July the 1st, sorry, at the Legacy House, Century Park, High Palm Road, South Rumfeld. Ticket $5,000, and it's also available at the desk at the back. Now, it is my pleasure to acknowledge and to say thank you to some important people and personalities that made this event a success. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the membership of the Burnham Foundation for conceptualizing this symposium and also for planning the symposium. I would also like to thank the management and staff of the Critical Labor College for providing us with this wonderful venue. I would like to thank the panelists, both Mr. Vincent Alexander and the Honorable Amanza Walton Desir. Thank you for your thought-provoking and insightful presentation. I see he would have left, but I would like to take the opportunity also to acknowledge and to thank the Mayor of Georgetown, His Worship Alfred Mentor, taking time out of his busy activities to be here with us, even though he has left. But more importantly, however, I would like to, one person I forgot. I would also like to thank our technical man, Mr. Drayton, who's responsible for live streaming and all the technical aspects of this symposium. I would like to say thank you. And finally, I would like to say thank you to you, the members of the audience, who not only your presence, but your participation and interaction is very much insightful in making this symposium a success. Thank you very much, and safely come, safely return.